just keep us alive. It nourishes us. It gives us a sense of well-being. Sharing food is perhaps the quintessential way of expressing hospitality and friendship. And on the other hand, food can be weaponized. Communal eating or food distribution practices can be misused to reinforce social distinctions and to exclude or marginalize certain people. At its worst, of course, food can be completely withheld, and history has a number of man-made famines with horrendous results. So it's perhaps not surprising that the ancient Jewish prophets, when they were thinking about what it would look like when God's kingdom was really established on earth, pictured it as a feast where there was an abundance of food, where everyone had enough. Other prophets said that when the day of the Lord came, when people really lived the way God had always intended us to live, everyone would have their own vine and their own fig tree. In other words, there'd be food secure. They'd have their own means to feed their families. They wouldn't need to rely on other people. That, as we might say today, would be heaven. But our first story in this series is definitely not very heavenly. It's about the prophet Elijah. His story is in the book of Kings, and we don't read from that book all that often at Cedar Ridge, but if you grew up going to Sunday school, you might remember being traumatized by that story of God sending fire down from heaven. Anybody remember that? No? Oh, a few people, okay. I remember being traumatized. I'm still traumatized. And this is kind of the OG Sunday school illustrator's work here showing the fire coming down. You might even have seen this picture. It brought back memories for me when I saw it. But there's more to Elijah's story than that. And so we're going to do a quick recap to provide some context for the scriptures that we're going to look at today. So Elijah's an interesting character. He suddenly appears in 1 Kings chapter 17. We read, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word.'" You know, I can't help actually but see the Sunday school pictures in my head when we read about Elijah. So we're going to briefly summarize this story with their help. All right, here we go. Ahab was, you can pretend you're in Sunday school, okay. Ahab was the king of Israel in the 9th century BCE, and he formed a political alliance by marrying Jezebel from Sidon, and he then followed Jezebel in worshipping the Canaanite god Baal. Now, Israel's God, Yahweh, was furious about this and sent the prophet Elijah to Ahab to tell him that as punishment for his idolatry, there would be a severe drought. That was the verse we just read. Elijah then hid out in neighboring countries and was fed first by ravens and later by a widow. Those two stories are very popular in Sunday school, and we're going to come back to them in just a moment. In the third year of the drought, Elijah went back to Ahab and told him to bring all 450 of the prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel for a contest. And all the people of Israel gathered around, and Elijah said, "Make up your mind. If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him, and we'll know who God is by who it is who's able to send fire from heaven." So the prophets of Baal prepared a sacrifice and called out to their God all day, but nothing happened. And then Elijah also prepared a sacrifice, but he made it extra hard by pouring lots and lots of water over it, which is no doubt a bit of a controversial thing to do during a 3-year drought. And he prayed to Yahweh, and fire came down, burnt up the sacrifice and the altar. Everything was just ashes. And all the people shouted, "Yahweh is God," and fell to the floor in worship. And then on Elijah's orders, all the prophets of Baal were slaughtered. And then he prayed, and it started to rain. Jezebel, though, was furious when she heard that Elijah had killed the prophets of Baal and vowed to kill Elijah in turn, who fled for his life into the wilderness, where he was fed by an angel. And that's the other story that we're going to come back to. Later, Yahweh sent Elijah to tell the servants of another king that he would die for his idolatry. And the king decided he wanted to speak to Elijah directly about this and sent a commander with 50 soldiers to go and get him. But Elijah promptly called down fire from heaven again and killed them. The king sent a second captain with 50 more soldiers, and Elijah killed them too, the same way. And the third captain said, "Please don't kill us. The king just wants to talk to you." And an angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Yeah, you can go with them. They're not going to harm you." Kind of feel like he should have checked on that before he killed the first 102 men, but that's just me. So Elijah told the king he was going to die, and he did, because he worshipped Baal. And then Elijah anointed Elisha to replace him as prophet, parted the Jordan River with a staff, and was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. So that's the story. It's pretty wild. It's very violent, as is much of the Book of Kings, which is one of the reasons we don't read it that much at Cedar Ridge. In many ways, this story has not aged well, I think. It's an exciting story, but from our worldview today, hopefully we find part of this story, well, morally dubious at best, right? It seems to have been crafted as a narrative to make the following points. First, the world is distinctly binary. There's right and there's wrong, good guys and bad guys. There are those who worship Yahweh, they're the good guys, and those who worship Baal, they're the bad ones. Second, Yahweh's prophets are strong and powerful because Yahweh is strong and powerful. He's stronger than Baal. Still today, actually, we sing songs that say things like, our God is stronger, our God is greater, God, you are higher than any other. And that reflects this worldview, right? That there are lots of gods, there are lots of powers at play, but Yahweh is the greatest. Yahweh wins every time, therefore. Yahweh controls the rain, sends the fire. Everybody can see that Yahweh is the strongest God. It's very obvious. So worshipping anyone but Yahweh is wickedness and will result in punishment. That seems to be how this story is told. But there are also elements of this story that undermine the dominant narrative. They occur throughout the text, but particularly in the stories that we skipped over and that we're going to come back to, where Elijah is fed by ravens, a widow, and an angel. So we're going to look at those. So first, the ravens. Not the football team, the story of the ravens. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So this is a great story, right? God directs ravens to bring bread and meat to Elijah every morning and every evening. Meat twice a day would have been pretty luxurious back then, so this is quite a treat. Now, some birds are clever. Crows, for example, have been shown to solve puzzles at about the level of a 7-year-old. And there's a girl in Seattle who has been feeding the crows in her garden every day for several years, and they've brought her lots of different gifts over those years to say thank you for feeding them. Birds are cool. Nevertheless, this is not usual behavior for birds, right, is it? To bring bread and meat to a man every morning and every evening. Now, presumably, the ravens could catch small animals for meat, but I do wonder where they're finding this bread twice a day during the middle of a 3-year drought when food is scarce. Now, this could have been a miracle. I am certainly open, who am I? Sure, it could just be straight as it says that it was ravens doing this. Certainly it could. But it could also be a misreading, because the words ravens and Arabians are extremely similar. In fact, they're almost identical in Hebrew. As you can see here, it's just the vowel signs, which are just those little dots. They're called diacritical marks. It's just those that are different. And none of those dots are in the Hebrew manuscripts that we have of the Bible. They are a later edition that was used to help people read Hebrew more easily. Now, the Septuagint, which was the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, written sometime between the 3rd and the 1st century BCE, translates this word as ravens. And pretty much, in fact, I think all of the English versions have done the same. They followed that and do translate it ravens. But as scholars note, it can be read as Arabians. Those exact letters, without the diacritical marks, are translated twice as ravens, both in this passage, and 3 times elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures as Arabians. Again, I am not saying, if this is one of your favorite stories, I'm not trying to spoil it. I'm not saying God can't have directed ravens to feed Elijah bread and meat twice a day, but God could also have directed Arabians to do so. And if it were Arabians, that would mean that non-Yahweh worshipping people were obeying Yahweh and were helping Yahweh's prophet, which would kind of subvert the overarching narrative of Yahweh worshippers are good and people who worship other gods are bad. Whether or not that's true in this story, it definitely is true in the next story, where we see a widow feeding Elijah. We read, "Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'Go at once to Zarephath on the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food.' So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow who was there gathering sticks, he called to her and asked, 'Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?' As she was going to get it, he called, 'And bring me, please, a piece of bread.' 'As surely as the Lord your God lives,' she replied, 'I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die.' Elijah said to her, 'Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land.' She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah." So now Elijah is instructed to go and see this woman in Sidon. But wait, we know about women from Sidon, right? The evil queen Jezebel, reputedly the cause of all the Baal worship in Israel, is from Sidon. So this is the heart of enemy territory. Yet just as Yahweh had directed the ravens, or possibly the Arabians, Yahweh has also directed a widow in Sidon to provide food for Elijah. So what do we know about this woman? Well, we'll read a bit later that she had a house, an upper room. So at some point she must have been relatively well off. But the famine, and perhaps combined with the loss of her husband, has brought her to the point of destitution. She's a widow with a young son. She's collecting sticks to use up the last of her resources before kind of giving in and resigning herself to death by starvation. And along comes Elijah, clearly an Israelite, and he asks her for water. So there's a severe drought caused by his God, Yahweh, and he comes to Baal country to demand water from a desperate widow. And as she turns away to go and get it, he asks, "Oh, and could you possibly bring me some bread too?" I wonder if that seemed like some kind of cruel mockery, taking the last of what she has. Is this what Yahweh does? Proves how powerful he is by punishing the wicked Baal worshippers with death by starvation, and then hammers the point home by taking the very last scraps from a widow. But of course, Elijah wasn't taunting her. He promised that if she trusted his God, she'd find she had enough every day through to the end of the drought. So she took the risk, and she did as he asked. She offered hospitality to the enemy, to the prophet of Yahweh, hospitality that was costly to her, presumably in the hope that Elijah was not actually exploiting her, but that his well-being and her own actually were inextricably linked. Now, I always assumed, sitting in my Sunday school class, that when it says the jar of flour was not used up and the jug of oil did not run dry, that was a miracle in the sense that she could just keep pouring and it would just keep coming out, and it would just magically refill. Perhaps she could pour it constantly, or perhaps every morning and every night when she looked, there would just be a little bit more. And that could have happened, right? That could have been what happened. But for a while, when I was a kid, my family had next to no money coming in. And my mother still talks about the miracles of daily food provision. She would just happen to be passing by a store when the owner was about to toss out some fish fingers that had got broken that he couldn't sell. Or a neighbor would just happen to end up getting too much of something that was about to expire and see if she wanted it. Or she just happened to find coupons that matched what she needed and meant that she could buy what she needed for dinner. Miracles, gifts of God, that meant she was able to feed her family and get us through a really hard time. And I don't think that they were any less miraculous for having human beings involved. And perhaps similarly, miraculously, people took mercy on this widow, took pity on her, and each day gave her just a little bit more flour and more oil. I don't know. That's just a thought. I have no idea what form this miracle took for the widow, but I've seen what form it has taken for many other people, my family included. And I do believe that we are called to be God's miracle to others. Our kindness, our radical hospitality is how people can experience God's provision. Me first, us first, America first is not a biblical ethic. As we read earlier in Isaiah chapter 58, we're called to share our food with the hungry, to give a place in our home to the poor who have no home, to give clothes to people who have nothing to wear. Now, the widow didn't give all she had to Elijah, but she was willing to share, and somehow there was always enough. And this stranger, this foreigner who imposed on her for water and food during a severe drought, turned out to be an incredible blessing. In this subversive story, the Baal-worshipping widow provides for Yahweh's prophet, and Yahweh provides for her. Yahweh, it seems, does not see the world in terms of the polar opposites around which the larger narrative here is framed. There are not good guys and bad guys, them and us. Rather, people need each other. Hospitality is called for. Strangers and foreigners, people of a different faith, are a blessing. I wonder what would happen if we seriously applied this story and these ideas to the issue of immigration, for example. How would we think differently? Then in the 3rd year of the drought, God told Elijah to go back and confront King Ahab. And we have that big showdown on Mount Carmel with the fire coming down from heaven and the prophets of Baal all being slaughtered. And then we read this. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he laid down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and then went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. So if those first 2 stories about the ravens and the widow are much loved by Sunday school teachers, this story is a favorite of women's ministries. What we need to do, ladies, when we feel frightened or exhausted or depressed is to have a nap and eat some cake. Honestly, that sounds good to me. I don't know. I'm a big fan of naps and cake. And there is truth that we need to take rest and we need to take care of ourselves and in order to continue the journey. I don't want to diminish that. I think that is actually a really valid point. But I'm not sure that that's the only point of this story. After Elijah had called down fire from heaven and then slaughtered all the prophets of Baal, King Ahab rode in his chariot the 20 miles or so back to his palace in Jezreel. And Elijah, we read, ran the whole distance and got there ahead of him. Elijah was pumped, right? I mean, he's just called down fire from heaven. No doubt he expected Ahab to tell Jezebel that Yahweh had won and that she, like all the other people, would fall on her face and declare Yahweh is God. I think Elijah probably wanted to be there to say booyah when that happened, right? But if so, Elijah was hugely disappointed. Jezebel had no intention of backing down. She would fight to the bitter end to defend Baal and would kill everyone in her way. So Elijah ran for his life. He left the country, he went south into neighboring Judah, and he kept going south to the very bottom of Judah, and then left civilization behind and wandered into the desert to die. Why? Well, because we read he realized he was no better than his ancestors. I think that's a telling comment. It seems he had assumed he was better than his ancestors. After all, he is the great prophet Elijah, the one who calls down fire from heaven. He was going to rid Israel of Baal worship single-handedly. Yahweh's prophets are meant to be strong and powerful, but here we see Elijah being a far cry from that. He's disillusioned, he's depressed, he just wants to die. And just as Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say she would kill him, Yahweh sent a messenger to Elijah to give him food for the journey ahead. The words messenger and angel are the same in Hebrew. And presumably the journey that he's being given food for is the journey back to Israel, where he's supposed to be serving as God's prophet. But after getting his strength back, Elijah kept going south for about another 260 miles until he reached Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai. And it was here that Moses saw the awesome presence of God that made his face glow. And it seems that Elijah was looking for a similarly dramatic experience. We read this. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. And there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you will anoint Hazael as king over Aram." So Elijah wants to meet with God at Mount Sinai, just like Moses did. But God asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And it's hard to read Elijah's response as anything but kind of whiny and self-righteous. "I've been working so hard and trying to do the right thing, and those people, those Israelites, have totally abandoned you. I'm the only one left who's faithful, and I'm all alone, and everybody's trying to kill me." And not only does that sound a lot like a martyr complex, but it's not even true. Now, the Israelites had previously forsaken their covenant with Yahweh, but they'd just recommitted themselves to God on Mount Carmel. And not everybody is after him to kill him, just Jezebel. And he's not alone. We've already read in the story that there are 100 other prophets of Yahweh who have escaped Jezebel's purges. And God will later tell Elijah that actually there are 3,000 Israelites who've never had anything to do with Baal. Theologian Walter Brueggemann writes, "As often happens to the zealous, Elijah has overvalued his own significance." Elijah wanted a dramatic experience of God, just like Moses. And God tells him to come out of the cave he's hiding in and stand on the mountain and experience God's presence. And we have this famous scene where there's a violent wind, God's not in it. Earthquake, God's not in it. There's a fire, God's not in the fire. And then the sheer silence and a voice asking exactly what it had asked previously. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, did Elijah experience God in the silence? Maybe. I think a lot of us, I can speak for myself, I have certainly experienced God in silence. But it actually doesn't say that. It just says that after the silence, he heard the same voice asking the same thing. And Elijah repeats his self-righteous answer word for word. Apparently, he had learned nothing from that experience. So, what are we supposed to learn from that story? I want to suggest a few things that occurred to me. First, speaking truth to power is godly work. God told Elijah to speak to King Ahab and tell him there would be a drought. That was a risky assignment, and Elijah spoke bravely and boldly. But speaking truth to power is dangerous, not just because of the potential repercussions, but also because it is so easy to slip into pride and self-righteousness. It's so easy to think it's all about us, we, few, the good guys, saving the world from them, the bad guys. And when that is our outlook, it quickly stops being about love and becomes all about winning. Elijah wanted to win. He chose vengeance when he slaughtered the 450 prophets of Baal. They'd already been defeated. We don't read that God directed him to do that. Elijah called down fire on the soldiers. God didn't tell him to do that. God told him there's nothing to fear from them. Fire is all about power and vindication and victory over the enemy. And God is not in the fire. It looks very righteous, but God's not in it. And then finally, we should be prepared for opposition. We should expect opposition and stay faithful through it. Elijah wasn't prepared for that. He seemed to think that one big showdown would do the trick, and then that's it. And when it wasn't, he just gave up. And despite the food and drink from an angel, Elijah continued to run away from the fight. Faithfully speaking truth to power, practicing generosity, recognizing the welfare of people from other countries and other faiths as being inextricably tied to our own. These are all very timely themes right now as we look at what's happening in our country. They are themes that seem very relevant to me to issues of immigration, as well as to the foreign assistance being frozen and cancelled under the current administration. And Hannah is going to come. Yes, she is. Going to come and talk to us a little bit about that particular issue and some action that we can take. Thank you.